My wife and I spent 31 years building a life in Columbus, Ohio. We raised two kids in a four-bedroom colonial on Elmwood Drive, took family vacations to the Smokies every summer, and somewhere along the way we stopped being adventurous. That was fine by me. I liked predictable. I liked knowing where my coffee mug was every morning and what was in the fridge on Sunday nights. What I didn't know, what I never thought to ask, was what my wife did every time she drove 2 hours south to her father's old property in Chillicothe. She went 4 times a year, every year, for the last 9 years of her life. I didn't know until she was gone. Her name was Ruth. We met at Ohio State in 1987, married 2 years later, and she was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, kept thank you cards in her desk drawer already stamped, and never once raised her voice at our children even when they deserved it. She was patient in a way I never managed to be. I was always the one who'd slam a cabinet or mutter something under my breath. She'd look at me the way a kindergarten teacher looks at a kid who's acting out. Not angry, just quietly disappointed, and somehow that was worse than yelling. She passed in November. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the morning I held her hand in the hospice room on Riverside Drive and watched her stop breathing. 7 weeks. By February, my son and daughter were already talking about the property. The property was a small workshop and the 2 acres around it that Ruth's father had left her when he died back in 2009. Old Gus had been a furniture maker, handcrafted pieces, mostly chairs and small tables, nothing fancy, but all of it solid. He'd built that workshop himself in the 1970s on a gravel road outside Chillicothe and worked out of it until his hands gave out. When he died, Ruth inherited the land because her brother had gotten the house. She never sold it. I always figured she just hadn't gotten around to it. My son's name is Derek, though I'd rather not call him that right now, because every time I say it I feel something tighten in my chest. And he had opinions about the property even before Ruth was in the ground. "Dad," he said one evening in late January, sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee he poured without asking, "have you thought about what you're going to do with Grandpa Gus's place? Because I talked to a realtor friend, and that area has appreciated significantly. You could clear 60, 70,000 easy." I told him I hadn't thought about it. "You should think about it," he said. My daughter, I'll call her by her actual name, Stacy, was slightly more delicate about it. She called me 2 weeks later and said, "Dad, I'm just worried about you managing everything alone. The property taxes, the upkeep, it's a burden you don't need right now." I said I appreciated her concern. What I wanted to say was, "Your mother has been gone for 3 months. She was my wife for 31 years. I don't know how to sleep on my side of the bed yet, and you want me to liquidate her father's workshop." But I didn't say that. I never say the thing I want to say. That was always Ruth's gift, not mine. It was Stacy's comment about upkeep that finally made me drive down there. I'd been avoiding it, honestly. The workshop had never been part of our life together, or so I thought, and I had no particular attachment to it. But when she said upkeep like it was a problem, something in me bristled. I wanted to see what I was actually dealing with before I let either of my children turn it into a transaction. I drove down on a Wednesday morning in early March. The trees were still bare, that gray-brown Ohio March color that makes everything look like it's waiting for permission to come back to life. I hadn't been to the property in probably 12 years. I'd gone with Ruth once when her father was still alive, helped him load some finished chairs into a truck, never had a reason to go back. The gravel road off Route 50 looked the same. The mailbox still had Hollenbeck on it and faded stick-on letters, Gus's last name, Ruth's maiden name. I pulled up and sat in the car for a moment before I got out. The workshop was standing. Clean, actually. The exterior boards had been restained recently. Dark walnut color. The gutters were clear. Someone had stacked firewood under the overhang on the east side, split and covered with a blue tarp. There was a small raised garden bed built along the south wall, bare now, but clearly tended. I thought I had the wrong address for a half-second. Then I saw the light on inside. I almost got back in the car. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. There was a moment where every instinct said, "This is something you're not prepared for. Just leave." But I'd driven 2 hours and I was 58 years old and I was tired of not being prepared for things, so I got out and walked to the door and knocked. A woman opened it. Late 30s, I guess, dark hair pulled back, paint on her forearms and on one cheek, wearing a canvas apron over a flannel shirt. She looked at me with the expression of someone who was not startled. Exactly, more like someone who had been expecting a conversation like this and had already decided to be calm about it. "You must be Mr. Hollenbeck," she said. I told her my name was actually Pruitt. I'd taken Ruth's name and we married because she was the last of the Hollenbecks and it mattered to her. But yes, Ruth talked about you all the time, she said. Her name was Simone. She was a ceramics artist. She'd been renting the workshop from Ruth for 9 years, a quiet arrangement, cash or check, $200 a month, which I later found out Ruth had been depositing directly into a college savings account for Simone's daughter. There was a lease, typed up on 2 pages, and signed by both of them. Ruth had kept her copy in a manila folder in the filing cabinet in our home office, tucked behind the folder labeled Car Titles. I'd never had a reason to look there. I stood in the doorway of Gus's workshop, and I didn't know what to do with my hands. The space had been transformed. The old workbenches were still there, but they held shelves of clay and tools instead of lumber. A wheel sat in the corner near the window, dried clay on the seat, finished pieces. Bowls, mugs, small sculptural forms that I couldn't name but found myself wanting to touch, were lined on wooden shelves along the east wall. The place smelled like earth and wood and something I couldn't identify, something warm. And on the far wall, above the shelves, there were photographs. Polaroids and printed photos, maybe 30 of them, pinned in a loose grid. Ruth in this room, at the wheel, laughing at something off camera. Ruth and Simone at what looked like a craft fair, standing behind a table of ceramics. Ruth and a little girl, Simone's daughter I understood, holding up a small lopsided bowl the child had obviously made herself, both of them beaming. There was a photo of Ruth sitting in one of Gus's old chairs, the kind with the curved back and the ladder rungs, holding a mug of something hot, looking out the window. Her expression in that photo was one I recognized from 31 years of marriage, and yet somehow had never seen clearly until I was looking at it on someone else's wall, in a workshop I didn't know she'd been visiting for 9 years. She looked at peace. Completely, specifically, deliberately at peace. I had to sit down. Simone brought me a chair and a glass of water without making a fuss about it, which I appreciated more than I could say. She told me that Ruth had found the place by accident. Basically, she'd come to check on the property after Gus died and found Simone there. A 28-year-old with a rented minivan full of equipment and a handwritten note asking if she could please use the space. She'd pay what she could. She just needed somewhere to work. Ruth had said yes on the spot. Then she'd come back 3 months later to see how Simone was settling in. Then again at Christmas with the food basket. Then 4 times a year after that, without fail. She never talked much about why she kept coming back, Simone said. But she'd always bring lunch and we'd eat at the workbench and she'd watch me work. Sometimes she'd try the wheel herself. She wasn't great at it. She smiled. She knew that. She thought it was funny. I asked about Simone's daughter. Her name was Addie. Adrian officially, but she went by Addie, and she was 11 now. Ruth had apparently been at 3 of her birthday parties. My wife had been at 3 of her birthday parties for a child I didn't know existed. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that, because people assume. I wasn't angry. I don't have the right word for it, hollowed out maybe, aware suddenly of the edges of things I'd taken as solid. I drove home that day and sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. I called Derek that evening. He asked if I'd thought more about the property. I said I had. He said great because his realtor friend could do a walkthrough any time, the market was good, there was nothing sentimental about an old workshop, and it would take a burden off my plate. I asked him when he'd last called to check on me. Not about the property, not about the estate, just to ask if I was okay. He paused. Dad, come on. I've been checking in. You've been checking in about the house, Derek. He said I was being unfair. I said maybe I was, and hung up. 3 days later, I drove back to Chillicothe and asked Simone if we could talk. She made tea. We sat at the workbench on the 2 stools Ruth had apparently bought and installed. I recognized Ruth's organizational logic and how they were placed, at the exact right height, angled just slightly toward each other so conversation was easy. She'd thought about those stools. She'd imagined 2 people sitting on them and wanted it to be comfortable. I asked Simone directly, did Ruth know she was sick? Simone set down her mug. She told me in May, she said, about 8 months before she told you. I nodded. I'd been suspecting that. She told Simone because they were together when the first symptom came. A bad bout of pain, bad enough that Ruth had to sit down and go pale and grip the edge of the workbench. Simone had wanted to call 911. Ruth had said not to. She had an appointment with her doctor the following week. She already suspected something was wrong. She'd asked Simone not to tell anyone, especially not me. I almost called you anyway, Simone said. About 4 months in, she looked bad one afternoon, and I almost found your number. But she made me promise. I asked why Ruth hadn't told me. Simone was quiet for a moment. She said, and I'm telling you this, because I think you deserve to hear it exactly. She said that you loved her so much it scared her, that if she told you, you'd spend every minute trying to fix it, trying to research, trying to find the solution, and there wasn't a solution, and she didn't want her last year to be about your fear. She wanted it to be about her living. I sat with that for a long time. It was the most Ruth thing I'd ever heard in my life. She was right, too. That's the part I couldn't argue with. If she'd told me in May, I would have turned our lives inside out by June. I'd have had her in every clinical trial in the country. I'd have been reading studies at 2 in the morning. I'd have been absolutely impossible to be around while believing I was being devoted. I knew it the instant Simone said it. I would have made her last year about my grief before I even let myself have it. I drove home. I didn't tell my kids where I'd been. Stacy called that weekend. She'd found out, through some chain of conversation I didn't fully follow, that there was someone using the workshop. Her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's already decided how she feels about something. Dad, you need to understand, if someone's been living on or using that property without a proper legal arrangement, there could be liability issues. We need to consult with an attorney before you say anything to her about the status of the property. I told her there was a signed lease. Well, leases from private parties can be complicated. We should have someone look at it. I told her Ruth had handled it properly for 9 years and I wasn't going to second guess her. Dad. Stacy lowered her voice in the way she does when she's about to say something she thinks is the reasonable adult position. I know this is a hard time. I know you're still grieving. But you need to protect yourself legally and financially. I'm not selling the property, I said. Silence. What? I'm not selling it. Simone's staying. Her daughter's staying. The lease continues. Dad, you haven't thought this through. I've thought about it more than you have, I said. And then, because I was 58 years old and I had stood in a room full of photographs of my wife being happy and I was done with deferring, I said, your mother spent 9 years building something important there. I'm not undoing it, so you can put the money in your retirement account. Stacy didn't speak to me for 11 days after that. Derek drove to Columbus and sat in my kitchen and gave me a long talk about estate planning and the importance of making rational decisions during grief. He used the phrase, protect the family's assets 4 times. I counted. I asked him if he'd known his mother was sick before she told me. He looked down at his coffee. She called me in September, about 2 months before she told you. I hadn't known that. She asked me not to say anything, he said. She said she wasn't ready. I thought about that. I thought about Ruth calling Derek, of all people, and asking him to carry that. She must have needed to tell someone who was mine, someone close, without it being me. I don't know if I understand it fully even now. But I found that I wasn't as angry at him as I expected to be. Then you knew her better than I thought, I said, which means you know this property mattered to her. He didn't have an answer for that. In April, I drove back to Chillicothe with a folder of my own. I'd talked to my attorney, a woman in Columbus I'd used for the house purchase years ago, and we drafted a revised lease agreement, 5 years, same rate Ruth had set, with a first right of refusal if I ever decided to sell the land. I also had a small envelope I'd found in Ruth's filing cabinet behind the Simone folder. It had my name on it in her handwriting. She'd written it in August, 3 months before she died. It was 4 paragraphs. I'm not going to share all of it because some of it is just mine. But the last paragraph said this: the workshop was the one place I went where I was just Ruth Hollenbeck again, not mom or wife or patient. Simone never needed anything from me except company. That sounds small, but it wasn't. Please take care of it. Please let her stay. And please don't let the kids talk you into something you'll regret. You know how you get. I laughed out loud when I read that last part, sitting alone in my kitchen. It was so completely her. Delivering a genuine emotional gut punch and then landing a joke in the same sentence, so you couldn't be wrecked by it without also being charmed. When I gave Simone the new lease, she read it twice, carefully. The way someone reads a document they're not quite sure is real. Then she set it on the workbench and looked at me. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," I said. Ruth would have wanted me to. Addie came home from school about 20 minutes later. She took the bus, got dropped at the end of the gravel road, came in through the side door with her backpack still on. She stopped when she saw me. "This is Mr. Pruitt," Simon said. "He owns the property." Ruth's husband. Addie looked at me for a long moment. She had her mother's directness. "Ruth talked about you," she said. "Good things, I hope. She said you were stubborn, but you meant well." I told her that was accurate. She nodded once, decided that was enough, and went to wash her hands before sitting down to do homework on the other stool. Like it was nothing. Like this was just where she did homework, and always had been. I sat there for another hour drinking tea. Simone made without asking. Chamomile, which I don't normally drink but didn't decline. Listening to Addie work through what sounded like a math worksheet while Simone turned a piece on the wheel in the corner. The sound Clay makes is oddly satisfying. That low, steady hum of the wheel and the soft scrape of hands shaping something wet and giving. Ruth had sat in this room and listened to that sound 4 times a year for 9 years. I began to understand why. Derek texted me in May to say that he'd been doing some thinking and he was sorry for how the conversations had gone. He said he knew he'd been more focused on the financial side than on how I was doing, and he'd like to come for dinner sometime if that was okay. I said it was okay. We had a decent evening mostly. He didn't bring up the property. Stacy took longer. She called in June with a formal tone that she slowly let go of as the conversation went on, and by the end she was just Stacy again. The girl who used to fall asleep in the back seat on those Smokies drives and deny it when we told her in the morning. She said she missed her mom. I told her I did too, every single day, and that sometimes you find out things about someone after they're gone that make you miss them even more, and also love them more completely, which doesn't make logical sense, but is true. She didn't have anything to say to that, but she stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes anyway, and we talked about Ruth. Not the cancer, not the estate, just Ruth. The birthday cards she kept in her desk drawer. The way she hummed while she drove, the laugh she had at bad jokes, the full one that she tried to suppress and couldn't. "I'm going back to Chillicothe on Saturday. Addie has a school art show, and Simone asked if I wanted to come. She said Ruth had gone to the one 2 years ago and had apparently cried over a painting of a horse, which Addie still brings up to embarrass her. I told Simone I'd be there. I don't know what the next few years look like. I'm still in the house on Elmwood Drive, still drinking coffee from the same mug, still not entirely sure how to manage a weekend without Ruth in it. But I know that 2 hours south of here, there's a workshop that smells like earth and wood, with photographs on the wall, and a kid who does homework on a stool that was placed at exactly the right height. And my wife went there 4 times a year for 9 years, because it was the place where she was most herself. I'm glad I didn't sell it. I'm glad Ruth knew I wouldn't. Once I understood what it meant. She always knew me better than I knew myself. I suppose that's the thing about loving someone for 31 years. They don't just know your habits. They know what you'll do when it counts, even before you do. I'm starting to believe she planned on that. I keep thinking about those stools Ruth bought for the workshop, the way they were angled just slightly toward each other so 2 people sitting there would naturally turn and talk. She thought about that. She went to a hardware store or a furniture place somewhere, and she stood there and imagined 2 people in conversation, and she made it easier for that to happen. That's who she was, someone who quietly arranged the conditions for good things without ever announcing she was doing it. I didn't see it when she was alive. Not clearly. And that's the part that stays with me. There's a version of me that could have been angry about all of it, about the 9 years she drove to Chillicothe without saying much, about the 8 months she knew she was sick before she told me, about Derek carrying that secret for 2 months before I found out. I could have turned all of that into a grievance and spent the rest of my life picking at it. Some people do. Some people find out their spouse had a whole private corner of their life and decide it was a betrayal, and maybe for some situations it is. But Ruth wasn't hiding from me. She was protecting something. There's a difference. And knowing the difference required me to be honest about who I actually am. The kind of man who, if told his wife had terminal cancer in May, would have spent the next 7 months making her illness into a project. She knew that. She loved me anyway. And she made a decision that took more care and more courage than I probably would have managed in her position. That's the thing about integrity. The real kind, not the kind you talk about at dinner parties. It's not always visible. It's sometimes a decision made alone, in a workshop 2 hours from home, to protect someone you love from their own worst instincts. Ruth had it. I'm still working on it. What I got wrong for a long time was thinking that strength meant having answers. I thought being a good husband meant being useful, researching, solving, fixing. But Simone told me something Ruth had said. She didn't want her last year to be about my fear. She wanted to live it. And she did. She sat at a workbench in her father's old workshop. She tried the pottery reel and laughed at how bad she was. She watched a little girl grow up and went to her birthday parties. She wrote me a letter she tucked behind the card titles where she knew I'd eventually look. That's not weakness. That's a person who understood what mattered and had the clarity to act on it even when it was hard. My kids are coming around, slowly. Derek had dinner with me last month and we talked about their mother for 2 hours. Stacy calls now without the formal voice. They're figuring out the same thing I am. That grief either opens you up or shuts you down, and the choice, more than people admit, is yours. I'm going to Addie's art show on Saturday. I'll probably stand in a school gymnasium looking at paintings made by 11-year-olds, and I'll be fine right up until I see something that reminds me of Ruth. And then I won't be fine for a minute, and then I will be again. That's how it goes. Ruth left me a workshop, a letter, and a kid who does homework on a stool she placed at exactly the right height. She also left me a reason to drive south on Saturdays instead of sitting in a quiet house on Elmwood Drive, watching the clock. She always knew what I needed before I did. I'm just glad I was smart enough finally to follow where she pointed.